We had planned the trip months before. 5 of us, all college friends, were going to spend a long weekend at a remote cabin in Montana. It was a break we all needed. The middle of the semester had been rough with exams, papers, and group projects, and we wanted to get away from the noise of campus life. The cabin belonged to someone's uncle. He only used it during hunting season, and the rest of the time it sat empty. It was way out in the woods, near no other houses, and you had to take a dirt road for several miles just to get there. It sounded perfect. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no obligations. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon. It was early October, and the air was already cold, especially once the sun dipped behind the trees. The cabin was simple but solid, 1 story, with a living room and small kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, and a big stone fireplace. There was a little porch out front, and behind the cabin stretched nothing but thick pine forest. We unpacked quickly, throwing our bags into whatever rooms we claimed, and gathered firewood for the night. We had brought enough food and beer for 3 days, plus flashlights, batteries, and even a couple of outdoor motion cameras, which one of my friends had insisted on setting up for fun. The first night passed quietly. We sat around the fire, drinking and talking, laughing about dumb things from school. At some point, someone suggested turning on the outdoor cameras just to see what they'd catch overnight. Probably nothing but deer or raccoons. We didn't think much about it. The next day we spent hiking around, exploring the nearby trails. We saw old animal tracks, a couple of broken tree stands, and even a small frozen-over pond, but no signs of people. That was part of the appeal. No one was out here. It was just us and the woods. That night was when things felt off. It was past midnight. We were all inside, spread across the couch and floor, half watching an old horror movie on someone's laptop. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the branches and making the cabin creak. At first, the tapping on the window was easy to brush off. We heard it faintly, soft little clicks, like twigs brushing the glass. Someone muttered it was just the wind, maybe a loose branch swaying. We all agreed, but the tapping kept happening. It wasn't constant. It would stop, then start again, sometimes on a different window. Light, irregular, almost hesitant. I remember feeling uneasy but not saying anything. Nobody wanted to admit they were spooked. Then one of the guys, Mark, got up. He grabbed his flashlight, slipped on his boots, and said he was going to check outside. He figured maybe a loose shutter or something was banging in the wind. We watched through the window as he stepped onto the porch, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the dark. The wind rustled the trees, and the light bounced across the ground. And that's when Mark froze. He called us over, waving sharply. We rushed to the window, and even through the glare of the porch light, we could see what he was pointing at. Footprints. In the dirt and thin snow around the cabin, we saw clear footprints, not ours. None of us had been outside that night, and yet, there they were, circling the cabin, looping close to the windows, almost as if someone had been walking slowly around, looking in. We all ran outside then, shining flashlights over the ground. The prints were fresh, sharp in the damp dirt, leading out toward the edge of the trees. But once they reached the forest line, they disappeared into the undergrowth. We didn't follow them. None of us wanted to step past the safety of the clearing. Instead, we double-checked the cabin doors, locked every window, and piled more firewood inside. Someone suggested it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe curious, but it didn't make sense. Why walk up to the cabin at night, circle it, and leave without knocking or calling out? Why watch from the trees? We stayed up late, listening for any more sounds. But after a while, the tapping stopped. Eventually, we all drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, we remembered the outdoor cameras. Mark pulled the footage up on his laptop. We gathered around, half expecting to see nothing. The cameras had been set up facing the front porch and the tree line beyond, with motion detection triggers. The footage showed the usual, some wind movement, a couple of small animals darting across the clearing. Then, sometime around midnight, the camera triggered again. We watched, leaning in. At first, there was just the swaying trees, the shadows moving. But then there, a figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, barely within the camera's range, half hidden by the branches. Not moving, not approaching, just standing there, watching the cabin. The figure stayed for a long time, over an hour according to the timestamps. They didn't move much, just shifted slightly, swaying a little in place. And then, before dawn, they turned and slipped back into the woods. None of us spoke for a long moment. We went outside and checked the area again in the daylight. There were faint traces where the footprints had been, but nothing new. We even followed the path into the woods a little, but it was impossible to tell where they had gone. The ground was too packed with leaves and brush. We spent the rest of the day tense, jumping at every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. We debated whether we should leave early. Some of us wanted to pack up right then, drive the long dirt road back to the main highway. Others argued it was probably nothing, maybe a local, maybe just someone passing through. We decided to stay one more night, but kept the cameras running and the doors locked. That night, none of us slept. We sat in the living room with the lights on, all 5 of us, listening for anything outside. We didn't hear tapping this time, but around 2 a.m., one of the outdoor lights flickered on, the motion sensor triggered. We didn't go check. We waited, tense, until morning. When the sun finally rose, we rushed outside. There were more footprints, fresh, leading right up to the windows, circling the cabin again. Whoever it was had come back, walking right up to the house while we sat just on the other side of the wall. That was enough for us. We packed everything up in record time, barely speaking. We loaded the car and left, bumping down the long dirt road, checking the rearview mirror constantly. None of us said it, but we all felt it. The uneasy sense that someone was watching us even then, just out of sight. When we got back to campus, we didn't tell many people about what happened. It sounded too strange, too uneasy, without a clear explanation. I still think about it sometimes. Someone was out there in the woods watching us for hours. Not just passing through, not just a random hiker. They were standing there, staring at the cabin, circling it at night, tapping on the windows. And we'll never know who they were. No strange twist, no big confrontation, no easy ending. Just a reminder that when you go deep into the woods, sometimes you aren't as alone as you think. And the scariest part is not knowing why they were there or what they wanted. We wanted to take a family trip somewhere quiet, away from everything. My wife and I both worked full-time jobs in Portland, and between work, the kids' school, and all the usual routines, we were burned out. We hadn't had a real family getaway in over a year, so we started looking for places we could rent in Oregon. Somewhere deep in the woods, where we could just relax, unplug, and spend time together. The cabin we found was an old rental place out near the Umpqua National Forest. It wasn't fancy, but the price was good, and the pictures showed a large wooden cabin surrounded by trees. The listing said it had been used as a summer rental for years, but was mostly empty during the off-season. We booked a full week. When we arrived, it was early April. The weather was cool, damp, and the forest was thick and green all around. The road to the cabin was long and narrow, winding through miles of woods before opening into a small clearing. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy, a 2-story wooden structure with a stone chimney and a wide porch. There was a shed out back and what looked like a sealed storm door set into the ground, which I assumed was just an old cellar. Inside, the cabin was cozy but dated. The furniture was old, the rugs worn, and the wooden floors creaked under every step. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. The kids, Anna and Ben, were excited to explore. They ran up and down the stairs, bouncing on the beds, checking every corner. The first 2 days went by peacefully. We cooked meals together, hiked through the surrounding woods, and sat by the fire at night. There was no internet, no TV, just us, a stack of old board games, and the sound of the wind in the trees. It was exactly what we needed. But on the 3rd night, Anna started complaining. She said she heard noises under the floorboards. At first, I thought she was just imagining things. Old cabins make noise. The wood shifts, the wind rattles the boards, animals scurry underneath. I explained this to her, and she seemed to accept it, though she still looked uneasy. But then Ben mentioned it too. He said he'd heard a strange scratching sound from the floor in his room when he was trying to fall asleep. Again, I reassured him it was just the old cabin settling, maybe mice or raccoons outside. That night, though, when the cabin was dark and quiet, I lay awake and listened. I heard it, a faint sound, almost like shuffling or dragging, coming from below, slow, irregular, as if something was moving beneath the floor. Not the quick scampering of small animals, something heavier, slower. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe an old heating pipe shifting or branches rubbing the foundation. Still, it unsettled me. The next morning, as I was making coffee, I noticed something odd. The basement door, which had been firmly locked when we arrived, was slightly open. I hadn't even paid attention to it before. It was an old wooden door near the back of the kitchen, set into the floor, leading down to a basement. When we first arrived, I tried the handle out of curiosity, but it had been locked, and I didn't think twice about it. The rental didn't mention a basement, and I figured it was just storage. But now it was ajar. I crouched down and looked closer. The old iron latch was undone, hanging loosely. I felt a chill crawl up my back. I didn't open the door. I didn't want to look. I called my wife over, and we both stared at it, uneasy. We checked the rest of the cabin. The windows were locked, the front door secure. We hadn't seen or heard anyone nearby since we arrived. When we called the property manager later that morning, he sounded confused when we asked about the basement. He told us something we hadn't expected. He said we should not have access to the basement because they had never given out a key. The basement had been sealed years ago, after a previous tenant, a drifter renting the place long-term, had vanished without a trace. No one had been able to figure out what happened. After the disappearance, the owners locked up the basement and left it unused. Hearing this, I felt a hard knot form in my stomach. We didn't argue. We didn't wait around. We packed up the car that afternoon and left, cutting our week short without a second thought. As we drove down the long dirt road away from the cabin, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees, watching us leave. We never got an explanation. There was no dramatic reveal, no big discovery, just a quiet, unsettling truth. For 2 nights, we had been sleeping above a sealed basement where someone had once disappeared, and something, somehow, had been moving underneath us. We didn't tell the kids the details. We just said the cabin wasn't a good fit, and we'd find somewhere better next time. But even now, I can't help but wonder what was under that floor, and why the door was unlocked. I try not to think about what might have happened if we'd stayed. I had been planning a long solo hike through part of the Appalachian Mountains for months. It wasn't the full trail, just a rugged section running through the backwoods of Tennessee. I'd hiked alone before, so I was comfortable with the isolation, the weight of the pack on my back, the quiet sounds of nature all around. It was something I craved. A break from the noise, the routine, the constant pull of phones and people and work. The first 2 days went smoothly. I kept to the trail, made good time, and found decent camping spots each night. The air was cool but not cold, and spring had just started to wake up the forest. I moved steadily, listening to birds, watching small animals dart through the underbrush, keeping an eye on the weather, and marking my position carefully with a map and compass. On the 3rd day, I'd planned to push a little farther, off the main trail, to explore an old hunter's cabin I'd read about in some hiking forums. It wasn't an official campground or anything maintained by the park, just an old, abandoned wooden structure deep in the woods. Other hikers had mentioned it online. A crumbling, half-collapsed cabin that hunters had once used decades ago, now left to rot. I thought it might be an interesting stop, something different from just setting up a tent under the trees again. By late afternoon, I found it. The cabin stood in a small clearing, surrounded by thick pines. Its roof was sagging in the middle, and one side looked like it had been punched through by a falling branch. The windows were empty, just dark gaps with splintered frames. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, swaying slightly in the wind. I didn't plan to sleep inside. I set up my small one-person tent about 20 yards from the cabin, near a fire pit someone had left behind long ago. There were old, half-burned logs still lying in a circle of rocks. I cleared the area, boiled water for dinner, and ate quietly as the sun set. As night fell, The forest closed in with its usual sounds: crickets, rustling branches, the occasional distant snap of a twig. I sat outside for a while, enjoying the cool air, the quiet, the flicker of my small camp lantern. Then I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon moving through the brush. But after a few minutes, I realized the sound was steady, measured, like someone walking on two legs. It wasn't rushing or darting like an animal. It was slow, deliberate. I switched off my lantern, crouched low, and listened. The steps moved around the edge of the clearing, circling, staying just out of sight beyond the trees. I waited, holding my breath. I expected to see a flashlight or headlamp, other hikers maybe, or someone out here at night. But there was nothing. No light, no voice. Just the sound of heavy boots pressing into the soft forest floor. After 10 minutes, the steps faded away. I stayed low, heart racing, straining to hear, but the woods went quiet again. Eventually, I got up, walked cautiously to the edge of the clearing, and shone my own flashlight around. I saw nothing but trees and shadows. No sign of anyone. Back at the tent, I checked everything: my gear, the food bag, the camp perimeter. Nothing was touched. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I double-checked the zipper on the tent and climbed inside, pulling my sleeping bag tight around me. But I didn't sleep. Hours later, maybe around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I froze inside the tent, barely breathing. The steps moved slowly, crunching over dead leaves and twigs, circling the tent. Not rushing, not trying to sneak, just moving as if inspecting. I thought about calling out, but something in me said not to. There was no reason anyone should be out here at this hour, without light, circling a stranger's camp. Finally, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, shining my flashlight across the clearing. No one. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked all the way around the tent and cabin, sweeping the light through the trees. Still nothing. But when I looked down, I saw the tracks. Boot prints, fresh, pressed deep into the soft ground, circling the tent. I hadn't left those. I barely slept the rest of the night, dozing in short bursts, gripping the small knife I kept by my side. By dawn, the forest felt empty again. The morning light poured through the trees, the birds were back, and the air had that cool, damp freshness. But the unease stayed with me. I packed up quickly, checking the boot prints again in the daylight. They were still there, clear and sharp, looping in a rough circle around where I'd camped. I got back on the trail, moving faster than usual. My plan was to hike out to a ranger station I knew wasn't too far off, just to check in, maybe report what I'd seen. When I reached the station late that morning, the ranger on duty was sitting outside, drinking coffee. He looked up as I approached, nodded, and asked if I was alone. I told him yes, I'd been hiking solo. Then, casually, he asked if I'd seen anyone else out there. I said no and asked why. That's when he told me. A camper had been reported missing 2 days ago. Solo hiker, male, mid-30s. Last known location? Near the old abandoned hunter's cabin. The same place I'd just camped. I felt the blood drain from my face. The ranger explained they hadn't found any sign of the missing hiker yet. No gear, no trail, no sign he'd moved on. He asked if I'd seen any fresh camps, scattered belongings, anything unusual. I thought about the footsteps in the night, the slow, deliberate circling, the fresh boot prints that weren't mine. I told the ranger what I'd heard. He frowned, took some notes, and said they'd send out a team to search the area again. He didn't seem alarmed, more concerned, like this was part of his usual work. People getting lost, wandering off trail, sometimes worse. I left the station soon after, hiking the last few miles back to where my car was parked. The whole way, I kept thinking about that missing hiker. I wondered if it had been him, wandering in the night, disoriented, maybe injured. But if so, why didn't he call out? Why no light? Why just circling the tent over and over? And if it wasn't him, who was it? When I got home, I checked the news for updates over the next few days. The missing hiker was never found. No new leads, no recovery. He just vanished. Sometimes, when I look back, I tell myself it was probably him. that maybe he was confused, maybe desperate, maybe too far gone to ask for help. But other times, late at night when the house is dark and quiet, I remember how steady those footsteps were, how careful, how patient, and I wonder if it was someone or something else. I haven't hiked alone since. We were only supposed to stay there for 3 nights. My girlfriend Emma and I had been invited by a friend of hers, Jason, to use his family's cabin in Alaska. We lived in Seattle and I'd never been that far north before, but Emma had visited a few times over the years. Jason's family owned the place but didn't use it much in the winter. It was remote, no cell service, no internet, miles from the nearest town, and Jason thought we might enjoy some time away, just the 2 of us. We flew up, rented a truck, and drove several hours into the middle of what felt like nowhere. Long stretches of road with nothing but snowy trees, cold rivers, and mountains in the distance. Eventually, we found the turnoff onto a rough, icy road that led up to the cabin. It was small, a 1-story log structure tucked between the trees with a wraparound porch and a little woodpile off to the side. There was no electricity, but there was a wood stove for heat, propane lanterns, and an old generator for emergencies. Inside, it was simple: 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom with no running water. We melted snow on the stove for what we needed. The first day was quiet. We unpacked, lit a fire, and settled in. The forest outside was silent except for the occasional wind pushing through the trees. The air was sharp and cold, and everything felt still. We made dinner on a small propane burner and played cards by lantern light. That night, the wind picked up. I lay in bed listening to it push against the walls, making the old wood creak. Sometimes the trees groaned as if they were leaning too far, their branches rattling like bones. Every so often, I'd hear a thud outside, snow falling from the roof. I told myself, just snow. Then came the whispering. It was faint, mixed with the sound of the wind, and at first I barely noticed it. Just a soft, drifting murmur, like distant voices tangled up in the air. I thought maybe it was the trees rubbing together or some strange echo from the hills. Emma stirred next to me but didn't wake up. I stayed still, listening. The sound faded after a while, and I drifted off. The next morning, we woke to pale sunlight pouring through the windows. It was cold, but the fire had kept the cabin reasonably warm through the night. I stepped outside to get more wood and noticed something strange on the porch. Small piles of rocks, 5 of them, each stacked carefully. Not just loose stones, but balanced, deliberate stacks. Each pile was maybe 6 or 7 rocks high, smoothed by weather, placed neatly near the porch rail. I called Emma out to look. We both stood there in the cold morning air, staring at the piles. Neither of us had touched any rocks. Neither of us had been out here after dark. I checked around the cabin. There were no footprints in the snow except ours from the day before. But the snow was thin in some places, patchy near the edges where the ground was hard-packed and icy. Maybe someone had come through and left no clear tracks. I felt uneasy but told myself it was probably some harmless prank. Maybe locals messing with outsiders. Maybe Jason had forgotten to mention something about the area. We spent the second day inside, reading, talking, staying close to the fire. I kept glancing out the window. The piles of rocks stayed where they were, silent and still. That night, the whispering came again, louder this time. It sounded like it was right outside the walls, brushing against the edges of the cabin, moving slowly around the outside. I lay stiff in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, every muscle tight. Emma shifted uneasily next to me. I got up once, crept to the window and peeked out, but there was nothing, just trees, snow, and the pale gleam of moonlight. The whispering faded after a while, and I eventually fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, we found more rock piles, not just on the porch this time, but along the path leading from the cabin to the woodshed. Small stacks, carefully balanced, marking a line between the trees. I was no longer telling myself it was a prank. We packed up our things quickly, stuffing our clothes, gear, and food into the truck. I didn't say much, and neither did Emma. There was a tension between us, like we both knew something was wrong but didn't want to name it. As we pulled out, I noticed movement near the tree line, a figure half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of someone standing very still, watching. We drove straight to the nearest town. At a small gas station, I asked the attendant casually if he knew anything about the area where we'd been staying, the cabin, the woods, the people nearby. He gave me a long look and asked if we'd seen any rock piles. I told him yes. He explained, in a quiet, measured voice, that stacking rocks was sometimes used by trappers and hunters in the area as a kind of silent signal. A warning. It wasn't meant for animals, it was for people. It meant someone was on private land, trespassing. It meant you were somewhere you shouldn't be. He said no one lived close by, but old boundaries, old claims still mattered to certain people. Emma and I stayed the night at a motel and flew home the next day. We never went back. Even now, when I think about that trip, I remember the cold, the whispering wind, and those careful little stacks of rocks lined up like quiet threats. I tell myself we were lucky. Lucky the warnings were just that, warnings. Lucky we left when we did. Lucky that whatever message they meant to send, we heard it. My brother Dave and I thought a weekend away at the Minnesota cabin would be a nice break. We both worked long hours. He was a mechanic and I worked construction, so we didn't get many chances to hang out like we used to. The cabin belonged to an old family friend, and it was deep in the woods way up north near a lake. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just trees, water, and quiet. We'd been there once before as kids, but not since then. We drove up early on Friday, loaded with gear, food, fishing rods, some old camping stuff just in case. The drive was long, a mix of highway and small roads that got narrower the farther north we went. The last stretch was just dirt, winding through dense trees, barely wide enough for the truck. By the time we pulled up to the cabin, the sun was getting low. The cabin itself was simple. Wood frame, small porch, 2 rooms inside, a wood stove. It sat maybe 100 feet from the lake, with the woods pressing in tight on the other 3 sides. There was an old dock, half sunk, and a fire ring near the shore. We spent that first night just settling in. Built a fire outside, grilled some food, had a few beers. The air was cool, and the stars were the clearest I'd seen in years. Out here, there were no city lights, no noise, no people. It was peaceful. The next morning, we went fishing, took the little rowboat out on the lake, floated around for a couple of hours, caught a few small ones, nothing big, but it was fun. Afterward, we chopped some firewood, made lunch, and sat on the porch drinking coffee, watching the wind stir the water. That afternoon, we saw him. It was maybe 4 o'clock. I was on the porch cleaning the fish, and Dave was stacking wood by the side of the cabin. Something caught my eye at the edge of the trees, movement. A figure just passed the clearing. A man wearing full camouflage. He was walking slowly, parallel to the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. His head was down, arms at his sides, not carrying anything that I could see. I lifted a hand and waved. He didn't look up. Dave noticed and came over, watching him too. We stood there quietly, expecting the guy to acknowledge us. Maybe wave back, maybe call out. But he didn't. He just kept walking, moving through the brush, until he disappeared into the trees. We figured he was a hunter or maybe a local, maybe scouting for deer or something. It was public land, after all. Still, it gave me a strange feeling, seeing him so close and not even getting a nod. That evening, as the sun set, I kept glancing toward the woods. I told myself I was being jumpy, that we were out in the middle of nowhere and people passed through sometimes. Still, something about the man stuck with me. We made dinner, sat by the fire, and turned in early. The cabin didn't have electricity, just lanterns and flashlights. We locked the front door, slid the wooden bar across the back, and got into our sleeping bags. The woods were dead quiet that night. At some point, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, maybe a sound, maybe just a feeling. I lay there in the dark, listening. Dave's breathing was slow and steady from the other side of the room. Then I heard it, a soft, slow rattle, the front door handle. I froze. The handle turned, then stopped, then turned again, slowly, like someone testing it, seeing if it was unlocked. I could hear the faint scrape of boots on the porch. I sat up, heart hammering, trying to stay silent. The handle stopped moving. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard faint footsteps, circling the cabin, moving along the outer wall. I didn't dare get up to look. I stayed perfectly still, ears straining. The footsteps went past the side window, then around to the back. A soft tap, the back door handle now gently turning. Another test, then slow steps along the other side of the cabin, back to the front. It went on like that for what felt like forever. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, pale light was creeping through the window. Morning. I got up quietly and went to the front door. My hands shook as I unlatched it. When I stepped outside, my stomach clenched.
Moody Bootprints.
They circled the entire cabin, across the porch, past every door, under every window. They matched what we had heard. Someone had walked the full perimeter, stopping at each entry point, testing each one. There were no other tracks leading away into the woods, just the prints circling, then vanishing at the tree line. I didn't need to say anything to Dave. We both knew. We packed up immediately, shoving our gear into the truck without even making breakfast. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the woods, half expecting to see that figure again, standing between the trees. We drove out before the sun was fully up, bouncing hard over the dirt road, barely speaking. Only once we were an hour down the highway did we start to relax, breathing easier as we saw other cars, gas stations, signs of life. We never reported it, never called anyone. What would we even say? That someone walked around the cabin? That they tried the doors? All I know is this: someone watched us. They watched us from the woods, and when night fell, they came to the cabin, checking every way in. Maybe they were looking to scare us, maybe they wanted something more. I don't know. What I do know is we left before we could find out, and I'll never go back.